So the next instalment of our Explainer series, Stuart, talking about three key things: load, duty and life. So in this one we're going to talk about duty and how that affects our guide systems.
Yep.
What are some of the key things to consider?
The first thing you look at is how far the product is moving. So, the stroke of the system. Sometimes that can be a linear movement, backwards and forwards, or for our continuous sort of track systems, that can be a full circuit. So what we need to know is how far that's moving, and then you get into things like how often does it need to move.
Yeah, and I guess, with a linear system, we're talking about a reciprocating movement, and obviously the length of the slide can affect the dynamics of the motion profile. Can you talk us through how the different factors affect the guide system in that instance?
Yeah, so there's lots of applications out there which are running nice and slow. They might be covering sort of a couple hundred millimeters a second, but there's also applications that are very high duty, and that will require high speeds and high accelerations. The acceleration rate is particularly relevant in terms of the load on the bearings. So the higher the acceleration, the more force that is coming from the payload being moved.
Yeah, and I know we've already talked about this, but of course the offset of that payload relative to the acceleration also has a bigger factor on the guide system.
Yeah. So if you've got your payload directly over the centre of the carriage, as we've spoken about before, that has the sort of the least effect on the bearings. Once you start moving it to the side or above, and then start including acceleration forces, you can be looking at much higher bearing loads, and that may require sort of larger bearings and larger slides. The other thing to consider is sometimes customers don't necessarily have much envelope. So you may have to accelerate very hard to get up to a speed because you only have a short amount of overrun at either end, and you have to achieve a set amount of velocity over a set distance of a slide.
Yeah, I guess that's a key point to remember, is you've got to allow a certain amount of distance to get up to your Vmax.
Yeah, exactly that. And you can sort of sometimes have applications where you may need very long strokes. And we've had applications of 30, 40 meters. All of that works with the Hepco slides because we can take a 4-meter slide and butt from one slide to the next in almost limitless lengths.
Okay, and the opposite end of the scale, I know this is always a fun challenge, but what about really short strokes?
So, short strokes are viable. They are difficult for ball-based sort of systems. Once you start getting into movements that are sort of multiple strokes per second, that's something that our technical team would need to look at and assist where we can. Okay.
So you're talking about hertz then in that situation.
Exactly.
Which is, interesting. What about, the actual how often it's moving? What do we have to consider there in terms of how the system performs?
Yeah, how often it moves essentially will tell you how many kilometres it's doing a year. And you can have applications that might be doing 200 or 300 kilometres a year, and applications on the other hand, sort of for packaging machines that could be doing hundreds of thousands of kilometres a year. All of that we can look at and determine the most suitable slide system. The Hepco guide is durable. That's one of its core sort of fundamental points. Is with the right amount of lubrication, those slides will last for years and years with virtually no maintenance.
Yeah, I mean we're talking about hundreds of thousands of kilometres in most instances. But what other factors will affect the life of the system?
So you've also got environment, what the sort of the temperature, whether it's sort of external environments, washdowns, all of those sort of things can have an effect, and may need us to look more closely at the loads and the overall life of the bearings.
Yeah, and of course, you mentioned about environment, and we know that the Hepco system works exceptionally well in some of those harsh conditions.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, thanks a lot, Stuart.
Thank you. Cheers.